We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build a decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Welcome to the special bonus episode of Energy Changemakers podcast, a show about all things distributed energy. I'm Elisa Wood, and today's guest is Vincent Petit, who is a Senior Vice President of Climate and Energy Transition Research at Schneider Electric Research Institute. He's spent over 25 years at Schneider thinking deeply about the intersection of buildings, energy systems, and the grid. And today he's here to talk about a challenge that's becoming one of the most pressing issues in energy policy, the gap between surging electricity demand and the infrastructure we have to meet it. The Institute's latest research makes a compelling argument, and at the heart of that argument is the microgrid. But here's what makes this research really distinctive in my mind. It doesn't make the case for microgrids on the usual grounds of resilience and decarbonization. Instead, it reframes them as something grid operators rarely get to hear about, a free resource. When rooftop solar and a smart stationary battery are sized to serve a building investors' financial interest, the grid relief they produce is essentially a beneficial side effect delivered at zero marginal cost. We're going to dig into what that actually looks like in practice, which building types and regions will benefit the most, and crucially, what role electricity tariffs play in making all of this work. Because the research makes clear, get the price signals right, and the private sector will finance grid relief itself. Vincent, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Very good, very good. Hello, Elisa. Thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. So, hey, let's start by talking a little bit about the Schneider Electric Research Institute. What is it, and how does it fit into Schneider Electric?
So the Schneider Electric Research Institute has been existing for 10 years now, right? And I've been there from the beginning. And fundamentally, we launched it, Elisa, because we wanted to actually do more research, do more thinking about the energy transition, right? And be able to contribute a little bit more to the discussion. And one of the things that we realized about 10 years ago, if you want, is that we thought the conversation was too much supply-centric and that we needed to focus a little bit more on the demand. So we thought that this is a topic and an area where we could contribute a bit more.
Makes a lot of sense. So, was there like a particular moment though when you said, we need to quantify this? Like what was happening out there that made you think that?
So on that specific paper on building, so this is obviously one of the areas, right, of the demand side that we're exploring, and we've been doing a lot of work on that since basically the beginning, trying to look at the effects, of distributed energy resources, the integration of electric vehicle, the overall electrification potential, in buildings. And we've been looking at that for at least 4 or 5 years. This specific paper, we did it because after focusing for a while about the economics of the transition, as you explained in the introduction, we thought that it was interesting to explore what would be the impact on the grid and whether that impact would be positive or negative. What we found out was that the impact is actually very beneficial to the grid.
So I found really interesting in this report, this discussion, this core concept of headroom. So for listeners who are not really familiar with grid mechanics and markets, can you explain power headroom and energy headroom and what we're actually measuring?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's indeed the core concept, behind the paper. And so let me back up a little bit before we discuss about the headroom to talk about grid productivity, right? What do I mean by this? If the demand of electricity over the grid was constant all the time, well, basically what we call the load profile would be flat over 24 hours, right? And I think this is something everyone listening to this call is probably aware. And as a result of that, we could claim that the grid is 100% utilized. No, unfortunately, as we all know, this is not the case, and actually the load is actually varying over the course of the day, right? With peaks and with troughs. And obviously, the outcome of that is that the grid, because it is designed for the peak, is relatively underutilized. And this is the whole question, the whole topic behind the concept of grid productivity. What's very interesting, Elisa, is that there's not been a lot of research on what is the actual level of productivity of the grid. Probably because this is a very complicated topic. But there is a very recent study from Duke University, which actually came up to a number. They made the analysis over 22 states across the US, and they came up to this figure, which is that the grid over those 22 states is utilized at a level of 53%, 50%, right? So what this means is that the grid is fundamentally underutilized. And it's underutilized because it's, again, designed for the peak and because the flow of electricity is not the same across the day. So what is the headroom in this context? The issue you have is that if the electricity demand is growing, right, as we see right now in the US because of data center, because of electric vehicles, because of more factories and so on being deployed across the nation, what's happening is obviously that this demand stacks up, right? The level of the peak of electricity is going up. And as a result of that, the grid needs to be adjusted, needs to be expanded. And so the whole question is, can we be smarter about that demand, that load profile, right? Can we flatten it a little bit in order to reduce the level of the peak and to optimize, the hours over which electricity is actually consumed? And if we do that, we actually create headroom. And the headroom is essentially the amount of electricity that we could add to the system without having to upgrade further the grid. And as a result of that, we would improve the utilization of the grid, that 53% I was mentioning about.
Interesting. That's a pretty big number, 53%. That's not a small amount you're working with here. Let's talk a little bit about the building types that you looked at. There were 5 across 13 geographies, I think.
Yeah. Well, look, we looked at different archetypes. So we have, commercial buildings mostly in this research, right? So we look at schools, we look at strip malls, we look at hotels, we look at office, and so on. The idea behind selecting different archetypes is that we recognize that the buildings don't behave the same, right? So you go in a hotel, you have a specific load profile. Of course, you consume more energy in the evenings than during the daytime. You go in the office, it's actually the opposite. So it's important to recognize that actually not every building behaves exactly the same. So the challenges, particularly in terms of peak, are not exactly the same. The other thing actually that you could add to that is the rising penetration of electric vehicles, because the more we're going to get, and this is something we don't discuss enough, by the way, but electric vehicles are completely changing the load profiles within buildings, because up to now, mobility was a separate sector, right? But now that we're moving with more electric vehicles, those vehicles are going to charge in buildings. So the whole conversation on building is changing. And this actually add to the complexity of the discussion, because again, the charging profile within those different types of buildings will not exactly be the same. The last reason why we need to look at different building archetypes is because the potential for distributed energy resources is not the same. I mean, take a mall, for instance, a very flat horizontal buildings. You can stack a lot of rooftop solar on that mall, right? But conversely, take a large office building with 20 stories, the potential you have is much smaller. So there will be trade-offs, and the overall potential you can get out of it is fundamentally different. And then because I think you asked the question, we're also considering different geographies, right? And there are 2 main reasons to it. One of them is, of course, that, between the south of the US or the north of the US, where I sit in New England. Of course, the sun is not exactly the same. The weather is not exactly the same. So the behavior, the needs of the buildings will be different. So we need to account for that. So we took 13 geographies in the US, but also in the rest of the world, in Europe, in Asia, and so on, in order to account for those differences. But then the most important thing with regards to taking different geographies is that actually buildings are facing different tariff structures, right? And the tariff, as probably we will discuss, have a huge impact on the way the microgrid is actually behaving.
Yeah, yeah, we'll definitely get into tariffs in a minute, but let's talk about the key finding with microgrids that they can achieve up to 60% power headroom. You talked about how there are different conditions depending on buildings and where they are, and what conditions have to be in place for that kind of recovery to happen? Is that where the tariffs come in, or what is that?
Yeah. So in part, yeah. So the 60%, it's up to 60%, right? So the average we get across because the whole value, right, of doing it across different buildings, different region is to get a range, right? So we get a range between 40% depending on the type of building, depending on the region, and up to 60% in the best of cases. And really, that's 60% has to do with two things. First of all, size of the system that you can deploy. I mean, the larger the system, of course, the more potential you have to actually manage, the more production you can generate, right? The more electricity you can produce, and therefore the more potential you have to store it, and therefore to adjust your load dynamically. So that's one. And the second thing is, of course, the incentive, the tariff, right? Because if you have favorable tariff, you think of time of use, demand charge, that type of, mechanism, then the microgrid is fundamentally incentivized to actually flatten the load curve.
That's really fascinating. And where, like in the world, and where in the US could this work best?
Elisa, it works everywhere. It's really the weather, of course, we could say plays a role, but I mean, it's relatively minor. It plays in the north of the US. It plays out in the south of the US. Fundamentally, it has to do with the tariff structure.
Interesting. And I was really fascinated by the discussion of smart EV charging. It appears throughout the report. Can you explain how smart charging and microgrid investment kind of work together? What happens if a building has one but not the other?
Yeah. So it's a great and very important question that's probably going to become more central, in the years to come as we see more EVs. So, like I was saying a little bit earlier on, EV is a big change because it's a big load and it's gonna be charged in buildings. So it's fundamentally changing the way the building is operating. We used to have in a commercial building, roughly 40% of the maybe 30% of the energy demand in a building is the HVAC. Now you add EVs to that. Okay, you're at 60-70%. You're completely changing sources of energy consumption inside the building and therefore the load profile. So it's very important to take that into account. Now, if you just charge EVs when EVs are actually are coming into the building, so think of an office building as an example. You're gonna get a big peak in electricity demand, and that's gonna be a problem, right? So this is where smart charging comes into play, because smart charging helps you alleviate, minimize the effect of all those cars coming into the office in the morning and charging all together at the same time. So smart charging is a fundamental, as a fundamental contribution to minimizing the peak. And it works very well in sync with the microgrid as a complementary solution. That's for, I would say, what we call unidirectional charging. So the basic smart charging, if you want, where you try to be smart on how you consume electricity. So we're going to publish a report on bidirectional charging in a couple of months, which is actually looking at another level, I would say, of collaboration between smart charging and EVs, where actually you can use EVs as a storage solution. And that's going to significantly improve the economics of the whole topic we're discussing here.
Fascinating. Look forward to that report too. Let's talk a little bit about the economics. It's compelling in this report. Tell us about the payback and the benefits to the building owner.
You talked in the introduction about zero marginal cost impact for the grid operator. So what I want to explain is that in the study we did here, what we looked at was we looked at the economics from the standpoint of the investor, which is in this case, the building owner or the building dweller. So fundamentally, the system that is being deployed is deployed to maximize or to optimize the payback of the guy who's investing, which is the building owner. So the system is not deployed to optimize or to create the most headroom on the grid, right? The headroom on the grid is a byproduct of the system that's being deployed. But fundamentally, the system is designed to optimize the payback of the building dweller. And the figures are actually quite striking because in practice, 80% of the cases that we've looked at have paybacks which are below 10 years. And within those 80%, 25% of the cases have a payback below 5 years. So it's actually a very profitable equation. And again, this is based on all the variety of tariff structures that we've been looking at in the 13 geographies that we've covered, right? So again, in the cases which are the most, interesting because the tariffs are the most, are better incentives to those systems, well, you get paybacks well below 5 years, right? So you get those paybacks below 5 years. So the people who are making the investment are making money. And on top of that, you create headroom on the grid.
And it's a good point to emphasize that this is about building owner payback first, and the grid economics, you said, are a byproduct.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So you make the argument that grid relief comes at zero marginal cost to the grid operator. Can you explain why that framing matters? Like, who bears the cost? Who captures the benefit?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's zero marginal cost because the building dweller is doing it in order to optimize its energy cost, right? So he's got paybacks 5-10 years, as we discussed, across different settings. And on top of that, because he's optimizing against the tariffs and so on, he's optimizing its energy, is maximizing its own self-consumption. So on top of that, he's changing from the standpoint of the grid, the load profile, right? So the profile of what it actually consumes from the grid, and is creating headroom on the grid naturally. And as we said, which is 20 to 40%, up to 60% in the best cases, right, of headroom is created from the standpoint of the grid. And of course, when you stack that all up, that creates a huge potential for relief on the grid. And therefore, it creates a very compelling equation for the grid operator. And in fact, the grid operator has not spent any dollar on this. So this is why it's a net zero marginal cost benefit.
It strikes me as a new kind of value proposition that you're putting forward for microgrids. I mean, it's kind of been discussed a bit before, but you've really documented it here, which makes it really interesting. But let's get into the tariffs. So the report identifies 3 levers, right? Dynamic tariffs, flexibility market access, and connectivity standards. If policymakers can move on just one of those near term, which would you say would have the most immediate impact?
Okay. I would say tariffs. Clearly, tariffs are the key. I mean, the flexibility market is very interesting, of course, but I think it's kind of a second order priority. Tariffs are the key because tariffs are going to create the incentive. If you were allowing me to make 2 priorities, I would say connectivity standards that you mentioned are also very important too, because one of the things you want to be doing is to actually build the ecosystem, right? You want to build the ecosystem of solution providers, of installers, contractors, and so on that can do this in an economic way, right? And again, it's the economic way is important because, you have big differences in cost of deployment across geographies depending on the maturity of the ecosystem. So connectivity standard is also interesting.
That is interesting. So places like Denmark and Norway show little recovery, while France and Canada and the US showed strong results in your study. What was the lesson there for regulators?
Look, it's the tariffs. Fundamentally, it's very much the same discussion. The tariffs are tariffs and the availability of the ecosystem to make the solution economically more compelling, if you want, through better prices. The price at which you deploy a system, distributed energy resource system in the US is 3 to 4 times higher in the US than it is in Australia. The cost of the products themselves, the modules are the same. The difference in price overall for the full solution is extremely high, and this has to do with the maturity of the ecosystem. So I think when you look at geographies, what's interesting is the tariff structure and the maturity of the ecosystem.
So what's interesting here is that traditionally it's been the commercial building owner who drives microgrid adoption, right? for cost savings, for resilience, maybe for sustainability. But you're making a different kind of case. You're making the case that the investment also benefits the grid. So how do we shift the conversation so that grid operators and regulators start treating buildings as a resource and not just load the way they do now?
Yeah. But so first of all, I think the conversation is evolving slowly, not necessarily at the same pace across all geographies, but I think you can still you already see some utilities that are actually embracing this change and trying to be a part of it, right? So I think they should be set as examples, right? They should be what they're doing, the problems they're facing, the benefits that they are actually getting out of that policy should actually be discussed, right? And because what I take away from the conversations I've had with a few of them is that they're seeing a huge economic potential for them, right? And also, they don't want to be left on the side of this transition, which will happen no matter what.
Good point. It sounds like we need just more case studies, right? When it seems like more case studies get out there, the more people come to understand and feel confident, right? They need to be confident, yeah. So say I'm a building owner or I'm a utility or a policymaker and I'm listening to this and I think, and I've read the report and I think, well, I want to act on this. What can they do first? What's the most important thing to start with?
I think the first step would be to evaluate the potential, how much you can get in your specific context, because like I said, there are differences across contexts. So there are many organizations, including Schneider Electric, who can support you. But I think it's the right first step is to try to quantify precisely how much you can get out of it. And then in order to build an investment plan.
What about for microgrids? I'm thinking about our microgrid listeners out there, and in some ways, this is a bit of a tough time for a lot of them because we've kind of changed the business model in the U.S. with the changes in the incentives. Do you think this research can strengthen the investment and policy case for wider microgrid adoption?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. It's going to strengthen the investment case, right? Especially in the US, because right now we've got electricity demand, which is growing, by 3 to 4% annually. And we're certainly seeing that it's going to continue for the next 10 years, and probably it will continue afterward. We just had a pause over the last 15 years with electricity demand being flat, but now we're back on track, right? And definitely, we don't need to work only harder. We can also work smarter. And I think by showing that making our buildings smarter, leveraging the distributed energy resource capability that we have on the rooftops of our buildings, we can actually save a lot of money overall, right, for everyone. So definitely, I think it's going to strengthen the case. I also think, Elisa, and I'd finish with this, that this is, I think, also largely inevitable because the cost of the products are going down, the total cost of ownership, the install cost of the complete solutions are also going down because of the maturity of the ecosystem. So the paybacks are getting shorter and shorter. So I think it's largely inevitable.
So the economics are so compelling, it's inevitable. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Vincent. This is really fascinating. And if anybody would like to read the full report, we will have a link to it in our article with this recording. Honestly, this is great and really interesting report. I'm really glad you brought this to us. Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.